We all come from different countries, and all of our different countries have different interesting names. In my case, I was born and raised in Nigeria, and my country is one of the two countries in Africa that are named after the river Niger. It's a river that's the third longest in Africa, and that name Nigeria was actually suggested by a woman called Flora Shaw, who was the wife of a guy called Lord Lugard, who was the British colonial administrator that called the shots in Nigeria a long time ago. So that's like the super quick historical version of where my country name came from. But also that's just one example of how a country was named. There are loads of countries around the world. How about all these other countries, right? Where did their names come from? The best way to start this video is to reference a brilliant article by Quartz, which suggests that most country names today around the world can be classified into 4 categories. The first category is countries being named based on a directional description of where they are. The second is that the name is based on a feature of the land. The third is that the country can be named for a tribe that used to be or is native to the country, and the fourth is an important person. Now, I'm calling this the country name framework, and essentially it suggests that there's a very good chance that most countries around the world have their names derived either from a description of where they're located around the world on the map or on the globe, or a prominent feature that exists in the country. And of course, if you look at a map, you often see rivers or certain mountainous regions. There's also the category of countries being named after historically prominent tribes that used to be native to the country or still remain native to the country. And finally, after historically prominent persons. So starting with this framework of where most country names come from, let's dig into as many different examples, all right? And try to test this framework. And also to make sure it's as globally representative as possible, I'll be drawing examples from different countries around different continents to make sure that we touch on different parts of the globe. But of course, guys, this is not exhaustive. It doesn't mean every single country's name can be figured out using this framework. It just means most countries' names can be figured out using this framework. So let's test it. The most obvious example here, if you're African, is literally South Africa. The country is located at the southern tip of the African continent, and that's where the name was derived. So it's named South Africa, as in the country that's at the south of Africa. And this one is pretty straightforward. Another good example of a country named based on a directional description of where it is actually Australia. But we have to dig a little bit deeper to uncover this one. So in ancient times, explorers referred to modern-day Australia as Terra Australis Incognita, which is Latin for unknown southern land. But as the land became increasingly explored and also, of course, increasingly known, Australis, which means southern, then ultimately evolved into the name Australia, which is what we all use today in reference to the country down under. And of course, as you know, Australia is located in the southern hemisphere, so it makes perfect sense. Another cool example in this category, and this one is by far my favorite, is a South Asian country called Timor-Leste. Now, at first glance, you can tell what the name means, but then you dig deeper into language and the meanings of things, and it becomes clearer. So Timor-Leste literally translates into East, East. And that name comes from 2 languages. Timor in Malay means East, and Leste in Portuguese also means East. Hence the name's meaning East, East. And of course, Timor-Leste is in Asia, which is the most eastern continent in the world. So again, it makes perfect sense. Now, there are other great examples in this category of countries being named based on the description of where they are. One of them is Norway, which was named by the English in reference to the country being located in the northern way of the sea. But in general, there are loads of countries that are named in reference to describing where they are located, which is an intuitive way of describing a place and also, of course, naming the place. It's actually very common to see countries named after obvious geographical features, and in a lot of cases, these features are either prominent rivers or lakes. Again, let's take the example of my country, Nigeria. It's literally named after the river Niger, which is a prominent geographical feature of Nigeria. It's the 3rd largest river in Africa, and it's also hard to miss when you look at a map of Nigeria. It's literally right there. And that's why I guess, it's pretty common to see countries being named after rivers. Now, even though it's pronounced a little differently, Niger, one of Nigeria's neighboring countries, is also named after River Niger. And there's also Chad, which is a neighboring country for both Nigeria and Niger. That country is named after Lake Chad, the 2nd largest wetland in Africa. So you've got 3 neighboring countries all named after a river or a lake. But then there are also, of course, other African countries that are named after rivers. The Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo are both named after the famous River Congo, which is Africa's second largest river. And other countries like Zambia and also Cameroon are also named based on rivers that are in the countries as well. Now, of course, all of these examples so far in these categories of countries named after prominent physical features and rivers, right? These are all African examples. And so it's probably easy to think that naming countries after rivers or water bodies is an exclusive African thing. But nope, there are examples elsewhere as well. In Europe, Bosnia is named after the river Bosna. And in South America, Uruguay is named after the Uruguay River, which flows across Brazil, Argentina, and of course through Uruguay as well. So no, naming countries after rivers is not exclusively African. We see this in other parts of the world as well. Now, aside rivers and lakes, countries can also be named after other physical features like mountains. An example here is Kenya, which is named after Mount Kenya. That's pretty straightforward. But then there's also Sierra Leone, which is named after the Lion Mountain Range in Freetown. There's Haiti as well, where the name of the country literally translates into mountainous land in reference to like the local terrain. But again, I have a favorite example in this category, and that example is Brazil. Brazil is named after a physical feature, but it's neither a river or a mountain. Instead, it's a tree. The name Brazil comes from a timber tree known as Brazil wood, which is historically native to the South American country. Now, Brazil wood grew all across Brazil, and it was incredibly valued by European textile companies several decades ago. In fact, throughout the 16th century, Brazil wood was one of the most exploited products from Brazil because Portuguese colonizers and also European textile industry players wanted to get their hands on it. It was valuable because they could derive some red dye that was great to use into textile. This tree, Brazil wood, was so popular that even though the official Portuguese name for Brazil was Terra da Santa Cruz, which means Land of the Holy Cross, European sailors ignored that official name and instead they referred to the country as Terra do Brasil in reference to the Brazil wood tree. And that name has stuck till today. And so yes, Brazil is named after a tree. And that's my favorite example in this category. A lot of countries today are named after tribes or ethnic groups that used to be or remain very prominent in the country. When people hear the word tribe or ethnic group, you probably think of the examples here will be African countries, right? But no, we'll go over to Asia for our first example. The name Afghanistan means land of the Afghans. Now, historically, Afghans were a specific but popular ethnic group in the area that's now today known as Afghanistan. But even though they used to be a specific ethnic group, today all citizens and everybody who's from Afghanistan officially is referred to as an Afghan. So Afghanistan means land of the Afghans. Now again, when you think of countries named after tribes, you probably don't imagine that there will be any European countries in this category, but there are. Sweden literally means land of the Swedes, and historically Swedes were a tribe based in what today is known as central Sweden. So the country is named after that particular tribe. And another European example in this case is France. Now, the country name France comes from the Latin word Francia, in reference to land of the Franks. And for those who don't know, the Franks were a historical tribe that occupied the area or the region that's now known as France. So those are two European examples of countries named after tribes or ethnic groups. Now, I know I said early on that I wasn't going to cite any examples from Africa in this case, but it's actually a cool one we can do. And that's Botswana. It's a pretty lovely country in Southern Africa, and Botswana is believed to be named after Tswana, the country's most dominant ethnic group. So this is just a few examples of countries named after tribes or ethnic groups. So it turns out that there are lots of countries named after a person. In South America, Bolivia and Venezuela are cool examples because, believe it or not, both countries were named after the same person. His name was Simon Bolivar. Now, historically, Simon Bolivar was a Venezuelan military leader who played a key role in the Spanish-American Wars for independence, and these wars were fought in the 19th century across South America as various countries fought for independence from Spanish rule. Bolivia directly takes its name from Bolivar's last name, and so does Venezuela. Because even though we all call it Venezuela, officially Venezuela is actually known as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Now, still in South America and not too far from these two countries, there's also the example of Colombia. Colombia was named after the famous explorer Christopher Columbus. You've probably heard of him. Now, obviously, Columbus is a major player when it comes to discovering and naming countries, because aside from Colombia, which was named after him, Columbus himself actually named several countries, and 7 of those countries that he named still use those names till today. Now, anyway, back to countries named after people. Let's go over to Asia for an example here. The Philippines is another great example because the Philippines was named by a Spanish explorer called Ruy López de Villalobos in 1542. But instead of naming it after himself like a few explorers might have done, he chose instead to name the Philippines after King Philip II of Spain. Now, you may not know this, but there are a number of countries named after Christian saints as well. So let's run through a few examples real quick. The Dominican Republic is named after Saint Dominic. Georgia is named after Saint George. Saint Kitts and Nevis is named after Saint Christopher, and Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is named after Saint Vincent, while San Marino is named after Saint Marinos. But the most emphatic example of a country being named after a Christian figure is El Salvador. And this is my favorite example in this category because it's literally named after a guy called Jesus Christ. In full, the territory now known as El Salvador previously was named Provincia de Nuestro Señor Jesucristo El Salvador del Mundo, which means Province of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. But this super long name was later shortened to the Republic of El Salvador, which makes perfect sense and was great in hindsight, because I'm not sure how you fit that initial long name onto an international passport, for example. So great thing that they shortened it. But yes, El Salvador is named after Jesus Christ. Now, you may have noticed that all of the countries in this category have one thing in common, and that's the fact that they've been named after men. And that's also because there's only one country in the whole wide world that's named after a woman. And that's St. Lucia, which was named after Saint Lucy. Now, technically, Ireland could also count as another country that was named after a woman, but that's only if you're counting mythology figures, because Ireland is named after Eru, a goddess in Irish mythology. Now guys, I feel like we've tested the country name framework and it works great. A lot of countries obviously are named after a directional description of the country, or a feature of the land, or the name of a tribe that used to be prominent in the country, and finally, an important person. But to be clear, there are some countries that are not named based on any of these categories. There are definitely some of them. An example is Burkina Faso, which means land of honest men. But I feel like the country name framework is pretty cool. So to wrap up, I've got some homework for you. Think about your country and do some research on its name, and try to figure out which category exactly might fall under in the country name framework, and let me know in the comments. That's today, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and of course give the video a thumbs up, and come back next week for more cool videos.